Hello and welcome to this weekly webcast as part of the Single Sales Principle program. And this week we're carrying on with the ERRICA process, the objection handling process, and we're almost halfway through. We're at the second R, which is all about repositioning. Over the last couple of weeks we've been talking about empathy, how we start the process of objection handling, and last week we looked at the idea of refining, getting under the skin of a particular objection and working out exactly what it means. This week we're going to look at repositioning. Once we've got this extra information from the customer about exactly what their objection is, we need to look at, well, how do we change it a bit? How do we adjust that objection so that it's easier to do something about? There are a couple of key reasons for doing repositioning. The first is to make sure that we understand it and that the customer knows that we understand it. It's to ensure that there is mutual full understanding of what the issue is. That's number one. Number two is actually about repackaging that particular objection, tying it up like a gift with a neat bow on top so that it's smaller and easier for us to handle by the time we get to the answer stage right at the very end of the ERRICA process. It's not about answering it now, but it's just about making sure that when we do get to the answer point, we've got something that we are capable of dealing with, if at all possible. One of the key ways of doing this is actually to be really specific about the structure of what we respond with once we've got the refine in place. We've understood the objection that they've had, and we need to add in, this is what you're saying, and you're saying that because of something else. So we're adding additional information into the objection that they're giving us so that we then have a particular route into addressing it when we get to the answer stage. If you remember back to the video from last week, there were 5 that we looked at, and we'll look at those same 5 again. If they've come out with the objection that the problem is I don't want to go ahead and buy this because it's too expensive, rather than just relying on it's too expensive, we need to add some extra stuff in there. So how about something like, you're saying it's too expensive because you're comparing it to such and such. That might be a good route to use if the comparison that they're making is either a very old comparison and they've not been looking in that market at prices and how they've changed recently. That might help us. Or it might be they're looking at an incomparable product, something that is of much lower quality, lower standards, has greater lead times and so on. There could be lots and lots of areas that mean there is a justification for the additional cost of the proposition that you're putting forward. And if that's the case, we can then save that information up in order to be able to answer it better when we get to that stage. Moving on to the second one, you're saying it's not big enough or small enough or the size type areas because you want to use it for X, Y, and Z. If we've got that X, Y, and Z and we know what the potential use is that is causing the mindset to be that this thing is not big enough or small enough, then maybe there is an alternative way around it. If it is, this house isn't big enough because there isn't room to store such and such, well, maybe that such and such doesn't need to be stored in the house itself. There could be somewhere else for it. Or actually, if you're moving to a completely different location, different type of property completely, well, do you know what? Maybe you don't need that item at all. Maybe it's just a legacy thing from the past, and when we get to the answer point, it's something that we can completely and utterly do without. So really have a think about, why is something too big, too small, too round, too square, the wrong shape, etc., etc. Get that because out there. The third one that we looked at is you need to go and check with so-and-so. Well, let's answer the because question there as well. Because they're particularly interested in, and then list off the sort of aspects that you've got when you've gone through the refine process and understood more about what that objection is. That may come out with a list of 2 or 3 or 4 things that the other person needs to understand more about. And even if they do still need to go away and have that conversation with somebody else, we can, when we get to the answer stage, pre-prepare them for how to go in and sell against those particular points that the person they need to go and talk to will have, because we've identified what those are up front. The fourth one was you need to go away and think about it yourself because, and then maybe you're not particularly convinced about this area, and so on. We're refining what it is that they are going to go and think about later. And we may be able to short-circuit the process and say, do you know what, by the time we get to the end of this process, you're not going to need to go away and think about it further because we'll have provided you with all of the answers and all of the comfort that you need on those particular areas. Again, we're defining what the reason behind the objection is before we move any further forward. And then the final one was the budget issue. It's outside our budget, and you're saying this because your budget was created last year or your budget was based on something else, you've already spent certain aspects. If we can work out why we are over budget, why what we're proposing is outside the parameters of what is possible, and it could be timing things as well as absolute amounts of money, then we've got an opening to be able to address those later. So the key thing about this repositioning stage is putting the actual objection and the clarity around that objection in with the reason for that objection. Both of those things will enable you to make the objection much better understood by both parties involved in the process, and will make it smaller, neater, and easier to handle when you get finally to the end of the process and the stage which we use to answer the actual objection itself. I hope that's been useful. Next week we'll go through the next step of the ERRICA process, and we're going to carry on until we get through to the end of ERRICA. However, if there are other areas you would like us to cover or questions you have, as usual, please do get in touch. Visit us at lemore.com. Thank you.